You need to sign this form. We're officially marking your horses as community property, Karen said, sliding a piece of paper toward me with a smug expression. I looked at her, then at the paper, then back at her, expecting a punchline. It never came. She was dead serious. My horses, Thunder and Daisy, were now under the HOA's ownership. I burst out laughing, probably a bit too loud, because the other HOA board members looked uncomfortable in their chairs. Karen, you can't be serious, I said, wiping a tear from my eye. Oh, I am. Your horses have been grazing on community land. That makes them communal assets. I leaned in. Karen, they stuck their heads over the fence and chewed some grass on the other side. That's not trespassing. That's just being a horse. She crossed her arms. The HOA bylaws clearly state that any personal property benefiting from HOA land can be claimed as community property. Your horses have been using the land. Therefore, they're ours. A slow grin spread across my face as an idea began to form. She wanted to play that way? Fine. I'd play along. The first time I met Karen, she was already barking orders at me from across the street. I had just moved into my house, a beautiful place at the edge of an HOA neighborhood. Technically, I wasn't even part of the HOA, since my land was privately owned before the neighborhood expanded. But that didn't stop Karen from trying. She waddled up my driveway, clipboard in hand, oversized sunglasses perched on her face, and a look that made it clear she had never known what joy felt like. "Excuse me, sir," she said, using that tone people adopt when they think they're in charge, but aren't. "Do you have a permit for those animals?" I blinked. "You mean my horses?" "Yes, those," she sniffed, eyeing Thunder, my black stallion, like he was just another stray dog. "HOA rules prohibit livestock." I smiled, already sensing what was coming. "I'm not in the HOA." Her expression shifted slightly. "Well, this whole neighborhood is under HOA jurisdiction, so—" "My property isn't," I interrupted, pointing to the legal documents I had posted on my fence, just in case someone like her showed up. "This land was here before your little HOA even existed. I'm exempt." Karen pursed her lips. "It's still an eyesore." I chuckled. "You don't have to look at them." She stormed off that day, but that was only the beginning. Letters started showing up in my mailbox. Noise complaints about my horses whinnying. Smell complaints about their manure. Aesthetic violations for not having a fence that matched the neighborhood. Every single one had the HOA letterhead, and every single one was pointless. I ignored them. But Karen? Karen didn't like being ignored. One morning, I stepped outside to find an HOA rep taking photos of my horses over the fence. A few days later, another letter arrived, this one different. It wasn't a warning. It was an official notice stating that my horses had been unlawfully grazing on HOA property. Ridiculous. My fence lined the HOA's greenbelt. Yes, my horses sometimes poked their heads over to munch on some grass. But last time I checked, sticking your head over a fence wasn't a crime. I crumpled the letter and threw it in the trash. That should have been the end of it. But Karen wasn't done. The next week, she came knocking again, this time with a few HOA board members standing behind her like backup dancers. "We need to discuss your livestock," she said, holding up an official-looking document. I crossed my arms. "They're not livestock. They're pets." She raised an eyebrow. "Pets don't weigh 1,200 pounds. Some dogs do," I shot back. Her eye twitched. "Regardless, they've been illegally using HOA land." I sighed. "Karen, they're literally just reaching over the fence." "Regardless," she repeated, ignoring me. "Since they've benefited from community land, the HOA board has decided to claim partial ownership. That means we'll be using them for neighborhood events." Then she handed me the paper. It was an HOA contract officially designating Thunder and Daisy as community property. According to this ridiculous document, my horses were now available for neighborhood events, which apparently included pony rides at the summer fair. I stared at her, waiting for her to break character, to say it was a prank. She didn't. "So, let me get this straight," I said slowly. "Because my horses ate some grass, you think you own them now?" "Yes," she said, as if it was the most logical thing in the world. I looked at the other HOA members, hoping for some sign that they knew this was all a joke. They didn't. One guy cleared his throat and muttered something about bylaws. I took a deep breath. "Well, if you own them, I guess you'll be covering the boarding costs." Karen frowned. "Boarding costs?" I nodded. "Yeah. Since they're yours now, you owe me for housing, feeding, and caring for them." That's 5 grand per quarter. Her face went pale. That's outrageous. I shrugged. Well, if they're HOA property, then it's the HOA's responsibility to pay for them, right? One of the board members whispered to another. Karen's confidence wavered for a moment, but she quickly straightened up. We'll have to discuss this further. You do that, I said, grinning. Karen stormed off with her crew, but I already knew she was in deep. She'd pushed too hard, and now she was tangled up in her own ridiculous reasoning. If she wanted to claim my horses, she'd have to deal with the consequences. The next morning, I sent her a formal invoice, $5,000 for 3 months of boarding, feed, and medical care. If she wanted Thunder and Daisy, she was going to have to pay up. I couldn't wait to see her reaction when she opened that letter. And that was just the beginning. The moment Karen got my invoice, the neighborhood exploded. I expected some kind of reaction, but not this kind of chaos. The first sign that my plan had hit home was the rapid, frantic knocking on my door early the next morning. Not the polite kind. This was the kind that screams someone is on the verge of losing it. I opened the door to find Karen standing there, her face an alarming shade of red, clutching my invoice like it was a bomb about to go off. This, she hissed, shaking the paper at me, is a joke. I took a sip of my coffee, enjoying this far too much. No joke. That's what horse boarding costs around here. Actually, I gave you a discount. Premium stables charge even more. She made a sound somewhere between a scoff and a shriek. This is ridiculous. You cannot charge the HOA for. I raised my hand. Hold on. You claimed my horses were HOA property, which means they need care. They need food, shelter, and a vet visit. I've been covering those costs myself. But since they belong to the community now, that means the HOA has to step up. Her jaw clenched so hard I thought her teeth might crack. You're being absurd. I leaned against the doorframe. Am I? I replied. You're the one who tried to claim my animals. You can't have it both ways, Karen. Either they belong to me, or they belong to the HOA. And if they belong to the HOA, then they need to start paying their share. She just stared at me, silent for the first time since I'd met her. I could almost hear the gears in her head turning as she tried to figure out how to get out of this one. I'll bring this up at the next board meeting, she finally said, spinning around and stomping off. I had been looking forward to that meeting all week. When I got there, the HOA board was already sitting down, with Karen at the head of the table like some dictator running the show. A small crowd of homeowners had gathered as well, eager to watch the drama unfold. Karen cleared her throat. Before we begin, I want to address a misunderstanding regarding Mr. Jacobson's horses. I smirked. Oh, what kind of misunderstanding? She folded her hands like a teacher about to lecture an unruly student. The HOA does not, in fact, own your animals. That was never the intention. I tapped the copy of her letter I had brought with me. That's not what you said here. A murmur spread through the crowd. A few of the homeowners were already chuckling. They'd seen Karen try to assert her power before, but this was the first time she'd been caught in such an obvious blunder. Karen's face tightened. What I meant was that their use of community land could be regulated by the HOA. I nodded. And because of that, you claim them as community property, right? Her lips pressed into a thin line. That's a technicality. I slid the invoice across the table. Then you owe me 5 grand. That's a technicality too. One of the board members, an older guy with thick glasses, cleared his throat. Karen, if we accept that his horses are HOA property, then we do have a financial obligation. We can't have it both ways. Karen shot him a look that could melt steel. I didn't mean literal ownership, Richard. Richard adjusted his glasses. Well, that's what you wrote. And if we refuse to pay, we could be accused of fraud. Karen's face twitched. She wasn't used to losing. Another board member, a woman in her 60s who'd never seemed fond of Karen, leaned back in her chair. I'd like to know how much of our HOA budget is even available for this, because we certainly didn't plan for livestock expenses. More murmurs spread through the room. People were starting to realize just how ridiculous this whole thing was. I decided to push further. Oh, and by the way, I'll need HOA approval for all future vet bills. Since, you know, they're your horses now. You'll also need to sign off on their dietary plan, shoeing schedule, and exercise routine. I assume you'll be appointing a board member to oversee their care. The look on Karen's face was priceless. She had dug herself into such a deep hole that there was no way out. The other board members were staring at her, waiting for her to make a move. If she refused to pay, She'd have to admit she had gone too far. If she agreed, the HOA would be stuck with a financial mess. She exhaled sharply. Fine. The horses are yours. The HOA does not claim ownership. I grinned. Glad we cleared that up. A few of the neighbors clapped. Someone even let out a low whistle. Karen, clearly beaten and humiliated, shot me a glare before she grabbed her papers and stormed out. I figured that would be the end of it. I thought she'd learned her lesson and would move on. I was wrong. The next morning, I found a new letter taped to my door. This one was different. It wasn't from the HOA. It was from a lawyer. Karen was trying to place a lien on my property. She wasn't just trying to find me anymore. She was going after my home. The letter sat in my hands, the words staring back at me in black ink. A lien. Karen was seriously trying to put a legal claim on my property over this ridiculous dispute. I should have been furious, but instead, I just laughed. A deep, genuine laugh that echoed through my house. She'd lost the battle over my horses, and now she was throwing everything she had into a desperate attempt to win the war. But she made one huge mistake. She had underestimated how prepared I was. I sat down at my desk, pulled out my phone, and called my lawyer. He was an old family friend, the kind of guy who loved tearing apart nonsense like this. After reading the letter, he let out a long sigh followed by a chuckle. She's either completely delusional or the most incompetent HOA president I've ever seen, he said. Maybe both, I replied. What are my options? Well, first of all, she has no legal grounds to file a lien. You don't owe the HOA any money, and they have no claim on your property. This is pure harassment. We can shut this down quickly. That was all I needed to hear. We drafted a formal response, a strongly worded letter threatening legal action if the lien wasn't immediately withdrawn. But I wasn't done yet. I'd been dealing with Karen's antics for long enough to know that just stopping her wasn't enough. She needed to face real consequences. While my lawyer handled the legal side, I started gathering everything I had on Karen. Every letter she'd sent me, every fake fine, every time she had overstepped her authority. I wasn't the only one she'd harassed over the years, and now that she'd gone this far, my neighbors were ready to speak up. One by one, they came forward with their own stories. The elderly couple she'd fined for having an unapproved garden gnome. The single mom she'd threatened with legal action over a kid's bike being left in the driveway for 10 minutes. The veteran she'd tried to force to take down his American flag because it didn't match the neighborhood's approved color scheme. It turned out I wasn't just fighting my own battle. I was leading a revolt. The next HOA meeting was packed. Karen walked in, expecting business as usual, but the moment she saw the crowd, she knew something was off. She tried to carry on like nothing was happening, but she couldn't ignore the tension in the room. People were whispering, glaring, waiting for their turn to speak. I stood up first, holding the letter she had sent me. Karen, would you like to explain why you tried to place a lien on my property over a completely made-up debt? I asked. She cleared her throat. The HOA has the right to enforce its rules and... Except I'm not part of the HOA, I interrupted. And I don't owe you anything. You tried to steal my land. Murmurs spread through the crowd. Karen tried to regain control, but it was already too late. Other homeowners started standing up, sharing their own stories of harassment and abuse of power. One by one, they laid out their grievances, turning the entire meeting into a public trial. The HOA treasurer, an older woman who'd clearly had enough, slammed her pen on the table. I'm done with this, she said. We can't afford another lawsuit. We barely had enough in the budget after the last time you pulled something like this, Karen. That caught my attention. Last time, I asked. The treasurer sighed. She's been sued before. A few years ago, she tried to find someone for parking their own car in their own driveway. It went to court. The HOA lost. I turned to Karen. So this is a pattern? Her face was redder than I'd ever seen it. She was gripping the table so hard her knuckles were white. This meeting is over. No, it's not, the treasurer snapped. We're voting. The vote was quick. Karen was officially removed as HOA president by a landslide. She tried to argue, tried to protest, but the board had spoken. She was out. The moment the vote was final, the mood in the room shifted. People were smiling, relieved, like a dark cloud had been lifted from the neighborhood. For the first time in years, they felt like they could breathe. Karen stormed out, slamming the door behind her. I thought that would be the end of it. A few weeks later, a for sale sign appeared in Karen's yard. She was leaving. Whether she was moving voluntarily or being forced out, I didn't know, and I didn't care. All that mattered was that she was gone. To celebrate, I invited my neighbors over for a barbecue. Thunder and Daisy got extra treats, happily munching away as kids took turns feeding them. The same horses Karen had tried to claim as HOA property were now the stars of the neighborhood. As the sun set, I walked over to my barn and tacked something onto the wall. My framed invoice for $5,000. A reminder that sometimes, the best way to deal with a Karen was to make her pay. Literally.